Sit. Sit.
Now there's a second method of pivoting into a neutral bow stance, but it involves an outward rotation rather than an inward rotation. So far we talked about an inward rotation. If you were, for example, in a reverse bow stance and you went from the, maybe you did a hammer fist to the groin, right? That's a very common move, either a hammer fist or a heel palm to the groin while you are in a reverse bow. Well, from here you can comfortably and easily pivot back to a neutral bow stance and maybe execute an outward back knuckle or outward hand sword or an outward elbow, right? If you were in that stance for some other reason, maybe you have to execute a block. You could execute an extended outward block, but they're all the outward motions of your arm rather than the inward motions of your arm that you can execute with this now, right? And there's at least one other common situation where this can occur, and that would be when you simply are changing direction. So let's just imagine that you are standing with your feet together looking at 12 o'clock and you have an opponent attacking you from behind, from 6 o'clock. And you're going to step your right foot back towards 6 o'clock and turn and face him, right? Now that's an outward rotation again. And of course, once more, this one could take advantage of that rotation by maybe executing an extended outward block or a outward back knuckle, outward hammer fist, outward heel palm claw, as long as it's outward. Those two motions obviously complement each other, right? And so now, all that was just stepping into the stance. We really haven't talked about stance changes yet, right? So that comes next, but that's going to be very, very similar to this, right? But we do have to consider opposites and reverses here. So as we're looking at the different stance changes that are coming up now, we're going to be looking at the opposites and reverses because just the idea of, for example, turning into a neutral bow stance while my right shoulder is moving forward in a right neutral bow stance, my left shoulder is moving back. And I can take advantage of both of those shoulder movements or body motions, or both sides of my body, right, moving. I can take advantage of them equally. So that means for our multiple attacker situations, that's going to be essential, right? But also you're going to find that just in general, on a single opponent, there will be opportunities where you can strike forward and in reverse. There will be some techniques where you have a stance change, and on the same opponent, one arm will be striking in reverse and one arm will be striking forward, and they will both take advantage of exactly the same stance change. So it's not just in multiple attacker situations that you are going to be using this, okay? So I guess it's fair to say that each, especially rotational stance change, is going to give us two strikes that are usually in opposite directions. Right? So now let's take a look at some of our most common and also important stance changes that we employ in order to get power to our hand strikes. Okay? One of the first stance changes a student usually learns is the turn into the forward bow stance. Right? You usually put a beginning student even in a neutral bow stance, and then you have them turn to a forward bow stance. Right? Now that action, when you turn to a forward bow stance, it does give you power to both arms, but in opposite directions, like I already mentioned. Right? Now, let's take a look first at the stance, because this stance it does take a lot of practice. Students usually struggle with this stance, and it takes a while to truly master it. It is more difficult than the neutral bow stance. To attain that stance, you turn your back foot until it points to 12 o'clock. You let your rear shoulder come forward, until it's in line with your front shoulder, and your shoulders are squared out to your opponent. Right? You shift your weight forward. You go from a 50-50 weight distribution in a neutral bow to a 60-40 weight distribution in a forward bow. 60 on the front foot, 40 on the back foot. Right? Your back knee locks and provides you a bracing angle. And again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. Okay? So beginning students usually use this stance primarily to drive their rear hand strikes, to add power to their rear hand strikes. Right? So this could be done with, for example, a vertical punch or palm strike. And of course, there's more than one way to execute a palm strike, depending on what technique it is in. Or, for example, a thrusting hand sword, again, executed with the rear arm. Or a reverse underhand hand sword. Or an inward elbow. But what most students take longer to recognize, and this is going now more into the intermediate level, is that the other arm also benefits from the turning into the forward bow stance, right? I said it several times already. So now we can have the intermediate student start taking advantage of that. For example, you could be grabbing with your front arm, right, and executing a punch with your rear arm. So now you're pulling with one arm, punching with the other, right? Most students learn that right from the yellow belt level on, right? It's dual action now. It's more difficult for a student to execute this, but at least they can grab with one and punch with another, right? And it does take a while to master that, right? Or for instance, right here, like doing a strike at the same time as a block, right? One goes forward, one goes back. We've talked about that in our point of origin video quite a bit, right? But it's a perfect example of how the forward bow generates force for both strikes in opposite directions, right? And then, of course, if you look right here, against the technique against the left push, same idea. One hand chopping. It's the thrusting hand sword with your rear arm. It's not a circular strike. It's really linear, and again, it's driven by your rear hand, by the stance change into the forward bow stance. But if you look at the other arm, which execute a frictional pull on the inside of your opponent's left arm, right, that is taking advantage of the power generated by the forward bow stance going towards the back, right, going into the opposite direction, right? Okay. But then what really gets lost when we talk about this is, especially at the black belt level and above, is that we now have the potential for dual strikes. Not just blocking and striking or grabbing and striking, but actual dual strikes. And if you look at the extensions of orange belt and above, that is going to be represented quite often. That is an advanced level of Kenpo, and is something that merits a lot of practice. And it is, for that reason, to be found usually in the extensions or a little bit on the brown belt levels. Right? So if we look at these techniques right here, for example, here's a green belt technique where you're literally striking to the back of his head at the same time you're striking to the front of his ribs. All driven by this one stance change into your forward bow stance, right? If you look right here, a technique against the handshake, which can also, of course, be a technique against the wrist grab, right? But same idea, you have, and this is part of the extension now of this orange belt technique. It's after the first move right here. You just push the shoulder down, you claw him through the face, and now you are perfectly poised for two strikes that, again, both take advantage of the same motion, the same rotation into the forward bow stance. One strikes on the way back, and in this case up in the way back, right? It goes upward and back. One strikes on the way out. Okay? And one last example right here. This is actually on green belt, one of the green belt extensions. Now here, it's not two strikes necessarily, but it's still quite sophisticated. You can see why this is on a green belt extension now, because after you did your hammer fist to the back of the neck right here, you're now about to turn into a forward bow stance with the heel palm to the face. Well, clearly that can be intensified or magnified if we borrow force, right? So if we pull the person into this strike, we have a more forceful strike. And that's exactly what you're doing with your right. So you leave your hammer fist engaged on your opponent's neck or base of the skull after you strike him with it, and you thrust the palm strike as you go into your forward bow stance. But as you are doing that, you are retracting your right arm as it is still engaged on your opponent's neck. So you're pulling him into that palm strike quite vigorously, actually. Same force that your left arm can execute moving forward, your right arm can execute that same amount of force coming back. Only difference is it doesn't have any travel prior to impact. You're not re-impacting here, you're just pulling, right? But the force is quite remarkable, actually. So if we look from a strictly logical point of view, we can say that